Okay, our first LOS is to distinguish between types of market. And we're asked to distinguish between factor markets and product markets. Put simply, factor markets are markets for the factors of production, the inputs into the production process, so labour, capital, materials, and therefore the end users here are firms that manufacture products. Product markets are markets for services and finished goods themselves, so here the firms are the seller. Notice as well we make a quick distinction with intermediate markets. Now essentially what we're saying is one firm's output is the input into another firm's production. So for example, if you've got a firm producing component parts that another firm uses in its production process, we're talking about an intermediate market. Right, we're now asked to explain the principles behind the demand and supply curves. So you notice we've set up Q dx, quantity demanded, and we're saying it's a function of a number of different variables. And the variables that we've got here are price, income, price of related products, so complements, etc., and any other factors that we may think of. So in other words, the quantity demanded is a function of a number of different factors. Now, of course, one of the most key ones is the price of the good. And we can see from our little diagram there, as prices are higher, quantity demanded is lower. And as price comes down, quantity demanded increases. So you'll never guess, but there is an inverse relationship between quantity and prices of goods. Now again, it's linked actually to the utility that we get from each dollar or each pound spent on a product. But at the moment, all we need to know is downward sloping. As price goes up, quantity demanded falls. Okay, let's have a look at the supply function. Again, what we're now doing is looking at the supply of goods. Now, of course, the supply of goods is going to be a function of the price, what firms can sell it for, and then also the costs of producing that particular finished good. So it's going to be all the costs of production, labour costs, material costs, overheads, IT, technology, and as many other factors as we care to add. So again, notice with both demand and supply, we're simply saying quantity demanded and quantity supplied is a function of many different variables. Notice, of course, here, supply curves are upward sloping. The higher the price, the more the firm wants to supply, because, of course, the bigger the profits they're getting from selling each unit. Our next LOS asks us to describe the causes of movements in supply and demand curve. Now, our first little graphic here shows a demand curve, downward sloping, of course. And what we're going to say here is changes in price move you along supply and demand curves. They do not move the curve itself. Changes in the other factors, so for example, individuals' income, complementary product prices, etc., they're going to shift the demand curve itself, as we'll see on the next slide. So let's just demonstrate that. So you can see at P0, the firm would sell the quantity Q0. If it increases the price, there we go, there's our price increasing, then the quantity demanded drops. But we're shifting along the demand curve. The demand curve itself is not moving. So price moves you along supply and demand curves. If any of the other factors that we identify move, that's going to change the demand curve itself. So, of course, shifts and movements, we've said essentially we shift along the original demand curve for changes in price, and so, therefore any of the other factors that we identify that drive demand will shift the actual demand curve itself. So in other words, income levels, the price of substitute products, the price of complements. Now, of course, as income levels go up, that could either increase quantity demanded or decrease, depending on the the income elasticity of demand that we're going to talk about a bit later. The price of substitutes. If the price of substitute products increases, we'd expect the demand for our product now to increase because it appears cheaper relatively. And the price of complements, as they go up, we would expect the demand for our product to actually fall. What is a complement? My classic always is gin and tonic are complements to one another. If the price of gin increases dramatically, people will demand less tonic water. So these factors are going to shift the demand curve. Now, of course, if income levels potentially fall, if substitute products become cheaper, if complementary products increase, that's going to decrease the demand for your product at each price level. So notice our demand curve shifts. Now, of course, if income levels rise, substitute products increase in price or complements fall in price, then that's going to increase our demand. Same with our supply curve. Remember, changes in price shift us along the existing supply curve. Changes in the other factors that we identify, in other words, the cost of production itself, it will shift the supply curve. In other words, if the cost of production increases, the firm will be willing to supply less at each price. If the cost of production reduces, the firm will be able to supply more at each price. So an increase in supply, notice our supply curve shifts outwards, typically caused by the factors of production, the raw materials, the labor, the overheads becoming cheaper, and therefore the firm being able to produce goods at a lower cost. And a decrease in supply, notice the firm is willing to supply less at each price now, is typically caused by these factors increasing. Now, our LOS asks us to describe the process of aggregating demand and supply, and also then equilibrium in the marketplace. So market supply is the aggregate of the supply functions of all the firms in the market. In other words, if you take each individual firm and you add all of their supply functions together, you get the market supply function. So notice what we've got here. We've got an example with 50 firms in the market, and we're saying for each individual firm, the quantity supplied, and we've set it up as a regression here, equals minus 250 plus 2.5 times price. So if we aggregate for the 50 firms, now assuming they all face the same supply function here, all we need to do is multiply that by 50. So multiply the intercept by 50, so 50 times 250, and multiply your slope coefficient by 50, so 50 times 2.5. And that gives us our market supply. So our market supply would be minus 12,500 plus 125 times the price. Now notice if we invert that function, in other words, at the moment, quantity supplied is the outcome of our formula. If we rearrange to solve for price, we end up with the formula that price equals 0.008 quantity supplied plus 100. The 0.008, therefore, is the slope coefficient of our supply curve, the gradient of our supply curve. Okay, exactly the same approach can be used to calculate market demand. Look at the demand curve for each individual firm within the marketplace and then aggregate them. So here is equilibrium quantity and price. Notice we've got price on our y-axis and quantity on our x-axis. We've got the supply curve. Now notice we're calling the supply curve marginal cost. And we'll discuss why that's the case a little bit later. And the demand curve is marginal benefit. Why is it marginal benefit? Well, because consumers would not be willing to pay greater than the marginal benefit of consuming one extra unit. What is marginal benefit? The additional benefit, the additional utility, if you like, that a consumer gets from buying and consuming one extra unit. You would never want to pay more than the utility you receive for that additional unit. Now, what we're going to say essentially is that the market in equilibrium will be where the supply curve, the marginal cost, equals the demand curve, the marginal benefit. In other words, the cost of producing one extra unit should equal the benefit that consumers get from consuming that one extra unit at equilibrium. And the market's going to automatically tend towards equilibrium. Now you can see if quantity in the marketplace was below the equilibrium of 3,000, where the supply and demand intersect, you'll notice that the benefit would be greater than the cost. In other words, the additional benefit of producing and consuming one extra unit is greater than the additional cost of producing it. Therefore, it makes sense to produce more, so quantity will increase. If we're on the other side, notice that the marginal benefit is now below the marginal cost. In other words, the utility gain from producing and consuming a unit is smaller than the actual cost of production. As a result, demand will drop and quantity will fall back to the equilibrium level. So we need to talk about movements towards equilibrium, and it's a fairly straightforward LOS here. So notice what I've done there is I've put a price above the equilibrium price. Notice the equilibrium price, of course, would be where supply and demand cross. Now notice at that price of 50, because it's above the equilibrium, the quantity demanded is below the equilibrium level, the quantity supplied is above. In other words, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. So we have excess amounts of this good in the marketplace. Supply is greater than demand. Now, if supply is greater than demand, there's only one thing that's going to happen to price. This excess supply, the only way to sell it is to cut prices. So suppliers reduce their prices, and as they reduce their prices, demand increases until we end up back at the equilibrium point. So we're going to end up moving the price coming down until we hit an equilibrium where supply equals demand. Now, it's going to be exactly the same if we have a price set below the equilibrium level. So notice, if the price is set below the equilibrium level, the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. In other words, we have excess demand. Now, because we've got excess demand, consumers are going to bid up prices. Consumers will be willing to pay more to guarantee supply. This will cause prices to rise until, of course, we end up back at the equilibrium level where supply and demand intersect at an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. So we are going to argue, in an efficient market with no impediments, then the market should automatically gravitate to its equilibrium level with an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. And that's going to be efficient because we're going to see that at equilibrium we maximize the total of consumer and producer surplus. And we'll talk more about those terms in just a second. Our LOS asks us to distinguish between stable and unstable equilibrium. Well, a stable equilibrium is when market forces move price and quantity back to their equilibrium levels. So you can see in our first diagram, the top left diagram, we've got a stable equilibrium. Because essentially, if price is higher than the equilibrium level, we get excess supply and prices are bid down, so we return to the equilibrium. If price is below the equilibrium level, then of course you can see demand is greater than supply, so prices are bid up. Okay, so that is an example of a stable equilibrium. An unstable equilibrium is therefore a scenario where we do not get a migration back to equilibrium. Now notice we've got two examples of that in our bottom left-hand box. Notice that with prices above the equilibrium level, demand is greater than supply. Now what that means, therefore, is prices will continue to rise. So rather than moving towards the equilibrium level, they're going to move away from it. Notice as well in that diagram, if price is below the equilibrium level, then supply is greater than demand, causing prices to fall. So in fact, we're moving further away from equilibriums rather than towards equilibriums, meaning we have an unstable equilibrium. Okay, so we have these unstable equilibriums if price is above the equilibrium level and demand is greater than supply, because prices will keep rising. We have an unstable equilibrium if price is below the equilibrium level and demand is less than supply, because prices will keep falling. Notice our bottom right diagram here has both a stable and an unstable equilibrium. Let's take that stable equilibrium. Notice if the price is above that original equilibrium, notice we've got a very strange supply curve that's backward sloping here. But notice initially above the stable equilibrium, notice that demand essentially would be less than supply, so prices would fall back to the equilibrium level. But we've also got an unstable equilibrium. Notice in the unstable equilibrium that above that unstable equilibrium, demand is greater than supply, so prices would keep rising. In other words, we would move away from that unstable equilibrium price. Now, our next LOS asks us to be able to calculate equilibrium, so we need to be able to do that. Now, we've just said equilibrium is where supply equals demand. So if we've got a supply function, and here we have quantity supplied as a regression equals an intercept of minus 600 plus the slope coefficient of 10 times px, and a demand function has an intercept of 3000 and a slope coefficient of minus 15 px. Again, notice that the slope coefficient is positive for the supply function because as prices rise, firms want to supply more, but negative for the demand function because as prices rise, people demand less. Now, equilibrium, of course, is where supply equals demand. So all we're going to do is set those two formulas equal to one another and solve for px. So here we are, setting them equal to each other. So we're saying the quantity supplied must equal the quantity demanded. Now all we have to do is rearrange the equations and solve for Px. So to solve for Px, with a bit of rearrangement, essentially, of our formula, swing the 600 across by adding it to both sides. That gives us 3,600. Add 15 px to both sides. That gives us 25 px. So the equation becomes 3,600 equals 25 px. Divide both sides by 25, and therefore px becomes 144. Now, let's just prove that does give us equilibrium supply and demand. So the quantity supplied should equal the quantity demanded. If we put 144 into our supply function and our demand function, well, let's start with the supply function and the demand function. You'll notice that the quantity supplied would be 840 units at a price of 144, and the quantity demanded would be 840 units, i.e. supply equals demand. Now let's have a look at excess demand or supply. So in other words, if our price is not 144, if it's below or above, we're not at the equilibrium level, so demand should outstrip supply or vice versa. Now, of course, if price is below the equilibrium level, we'd expect quantity demanded to be bigger than quantity supplied. Okay, well, let's have a look at it. Plugging in 120 for Px, we get a quantity supplied of 600 from our formula, and a quantity demanded of 1,200. In other words, demand outstrips supply by 600 units, and that's going to bid prices up. Now, of course, at a price of 160, now given the equilibrium price was 144, now at price 160, supply, of course, should outstrip demand. So supply, 1,000 units, demand, 600 units, we've got excess supply of 400 units. And the only way firms are going to be able to shift these goods and services is to reduce prices. So price should start to fall. Now our next reading is on auctions, where we need to describe the features of various auctions. I have to say this is one of the kind of things where I would typically tell a class, read it at home. But I will go through some of the key points to you. Ascending price auction. So what we're saying is, look, auctions are a different way of establishing equilibrium prices. So let's start off with our common value auction. Now the key bit with the common value auction is the value of the item being auctioned will be the same for all the bidders. Now the really key bullet point here is the bidders do not know the value at the time of auction. They do not know how much this will be actually worth to them. And we've said, beware the winner's curse. The danger in this scenario, therefore, is bidding too much. Given that you don't know the value of the item, you could overpay, essentially, for it. Now, the classic example they talk about here is mining and oil extraction. Imagine you're bidding for a lease to extract oil or to mine an area. You don't know what the value is. You don't know how much oil that particular field will produce, and you don't know what future oil prices will be. Okay, so there is a danger you can overbid. Now notice, let's compare that to a private value auction. The value of the item is different for all bidders. We then argue that the maximum bid that anybody would be willing to place is the value that item has for the bidder. And we're going to call that the reservation price. Now, they talk about antiques, things like fine art here, because the value is in the eye of the beholder. Not everyone would assign the same value to a piece of artwork, for example. Okay, so let's have a look at the type of auctions. Probably the most common type of auction is an ascending price auction, which apparently is called an English auction. That's news to me. Now, essentially, the bidder in an auction, the bidder must bid higher than the previous bid. In other words, you're in an open auction room, bids come in, each bid must be incrementally higher than the previous bid. Everybody in the auction rooms knows what bids are being, what the bids are. So in other words, they know that if they want the good that's being auctioned, they will have to bid higher than the last price announced in the marketplace. Now this process continues until no one is willing to outbid the last bidder. And then the highest bidder wins, and they pay the price that they bid. And they've given an example here of automobile auctions, car auctions. In the UK as well, we have property auctions that work exactly the same way. Okay, now let's have a look at a sealed auction bid. Notice each bidder provides one bid. You can't rebid, which you can do on an ascending price auction. If you get outbid on an ascending price auction, you can just bid a higher price. Not with a sealed bid. You only bid one price. And you do not know what other people have bid. So your big danger essentially here is you could bid a price too low and lose the auction and not obtain the asset. Because the highest bid is going to win and they're going to pay the price that they've bid. Now notice we argue here that the optimal bid is less than the reservation price. The reservation price is the price, if you like, or the value of the item to the person bidding. But they're saying the optimal bid for them would not be to bid the value to them. Because here, the optimal bid will be just slightly higher than whoever has bid the second highest price. Because all we want to do is win the bid, essentially. So, that's a good example, essentially. The optimal bid is slightly higher, only slightly higher than the second highest bid. Remember, reservation price is the actual value to the bidder. VicRay auctions, second priced sealed bid auction. Each bidder provides one bid. All bids remain unknown to unbidders, so it's concealed like the previous one. But notice here, if you win, the highest bid doesn't pay the price that they bid. Instead, they pay the price of the second highest bidder. Now, in this case, we argue that your optimal bid price is your reservation price. Because all you want to do is win the auction. And when you do win the auction, you're not going to pay your reservation price. You're going to pay the second highest bid. Okay. And apparently, as you can see, we've said apparently, they do this in the world of stamp collecting. We'll have to take Swayze's word for that one. If that's what they say, I'm sure that's how it works. Descending price auctions. Now, we see these in financial markets in particular, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them in just a second in terms of the bond markets. Notice here we start with a price, and we start with a very high price in the auction. In fact, a price higher than which bidders are willing to pay. So in other words, nobody bids. The price is then reduced down and down and down until we find someone willing to bid, and they bid. And they state their quantity that they're willing to bid. And the price is then further reduced until all of the quantity of the item being sold is finally sold. Notice bidders pay their bid price. So if you bid early, you could end up paying a higher price than people that bid late. Because remember, we're going to keep on reducing that bid price until all the items have been sold, and often used therefore in bond markets. Subsequent bidders will pay a lower price than previous bidders. Now, that really then takes us to our Dutch auctions and modified Dutch auctions. So let's start off with a modified Dutch auction. We looked at Dutch auction on the previous slide, where each bidder paid the price that they bid. Now, a modified Dutch auction is going to be exactly the same, but instead you don't pay the price you bid, you pay a single price. And that single price is typically the lowest bid price that completely cleared the market. In other words, when we get to the lowest bid and then there is no more supply of the product being auctioned, that sets the single price. Notice this is what's used in the treasury markets. A non-competitive bid is where you just bid for quantity, but you don't set your bid price, and you just simply pay the single price from the modified Dutch auction. Again, this is used in US Treasury markets, it's used in UK gilt markets, very common for government bond auctions. Right, okay, that's auctions done. Good. Our next LOS asks us to calculate and interpret consumer surplus and producer surplus. Now, remember, the equilibrium of supply and demand sets the market price. Now, for certain consumers, they would have been willing to pay a higher price. And the difference between the price that they were willing to pay and the market price is known as consumer surplus. So you can see in our example here, one unit would have been sold with a price of $5. But actually the market price is only $3, so that consumer would receive a surplus of $2. There we go. At a price of $4.50, 2 units would have been sold. Now again, compare that to the market price. Okay, so the consumer surplus for the second gallon of oil or whatever we're looking at here, they're willing to pay $4.50. They only get charged the market price of $3. We've got a consumer surplus of $1.50. And for the third unit, they're willing to pay $4, market price $3, consumer surplus $1. And for the fourth unit, they're willing to pay $3.50. They're only charged $3, consumer surplus of 50 cents. And then, of course, for the fifth unit, they're willing to pay $3. The market price is $3, so consumer surplus is 0. So notice, if we want to work out our consumer surplus, we're essentially looking at a triangle here. And remember, the area of a triangle is half base times height. So we can calculate total consumer surplus by doing half the base. Well, of course, half the base is 5 units. Half of that is 2.5 times the height. $5 minus $3 times 2. So 2.5 times 2 gives us a total consumer surplus of $5. Now here we are looking at our market in equilibrium again, and talking now about the efficiency of equilibrium. So notice our market is in equilibrium at a price of $500, and in that situation, quantity supplied and quantity demanded would be 3,000. Now, we talk about this as being efficient, because at equilibrium, we maximize the aggregate, i.e. the combined total, of consumer and producer surplus. At any other quantity away from the equilibrium price, we're going to see that either consumer or producer surplus is affected, okay, but in total, consumer surplus will fall. And that decrease we're going to refer to as a deadweight loss. Okay, so there's our, again, if we're looking at producer surplus. Now let's talk about producer. We've said consumer surplus is because people would be willing to pay higher than the market price. Producer surplus is just the flip side. Some producers would be willing to sell at a lower price than the marketplace. So essentially, let's look at the producer surplus for the 2,500th ton. Suppliers would have been willing to accept $400, but in fact they're receiving $500. So the producer surplus for the 2,500th ton would be $100. Okay, now we know that equilibrium in a competitive marketplace is where supply equals demand. Okay, and of course, we know that the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. That is why we are in equilibrium. There's no upward force. Remember, if demand is outstrips supply, prices rise. And of course, there's no downward force if supply outstrips demand. Now, the key point is to talk about efficient resource allocation. We have efficient resource allocation because we're arguing the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. The benefit from consumers from the production of the last unit and then consumption, i.e. the utility they receive from consuming the last unit, is equal to the cost of producing that last unit. And the key to note is we maximize the aggregate of both consumer and producer surplus, meaning we're getting the best out of limited resources, so we're efficient in our allocation of limited resources. Now, let's have a look at the impact of over and under production. So we're starting at a point where we're looking at being at equilibrium. Here we're going to look at underproduction first of all. Now, with underproduction, the quantity supplied in the marketplace, or the quantity produced, will be less than the equilibrium level. So there we go, shifting back. Now, notice at that level, at Q under, as we've called it on this diagram, the quantity supplied is less than the quantity essentially demanded. Or what I should say, the marginal cost is less than the marginal benefit. Okay. So marginal benefit is higher. Now, what that leads to is a deadweight loss. This is lost surplus. In other words, at that quantity, in fact, at that quantity, we can see the small triangle in the top is consumer surplus, and our kind of strange rectangular shape is producer surplus. But the aggregate of the two is less than the aggregate would have been at equilibrium. And that difference is known as a deadweight loss. It's a loss of surplus. So there's our producer surplus, the strange rectangular shape, and there's our consumer surplus. Beautiful. Overproduction. Now, overproduction is actually going to be fairly difficult to draw in terms of the deadweight loss, but we can have a go at it. Now, because we don't really see overproduction very easily on a diagram here, simply because overproduction is caused by typically the supply curve shifting outwards, normally due to things like government subsidies. So again, we're going to start off in equilibrium, but now for whatever purpose, the quantity in the marketplace is greater than the equilibrium quantity. Now you'll notice here that demand is less than supply. In other words, the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost. Now what we're seeing here is the original supply curve. We're not seeing the supply curve after the subsidy or whatever is causing this. Now again, our little triangle is going to be dead weight loss. Again, notice marginal benefit is less than marginal cost. That is your key thing to take on this slide. So both over and under production are inefficient because they do not maximize the aggregate of consumer and producer surplus. And that loss in surplus is referred to as our dead weight loss. Now, our LOS next asks us to be able to calculate consumer and producer surplus. And what we need to be remembering here is we're looking at two triangles on our diagram. Okay, now of course we know to calculate the area of a triangle, we're going to use half base times height. So we're going to use the supply and demand curves that we computed earlier for equilibrium. If you remember, we came up with a price of 144 and an equilibrium quantity of 840. Now, what we're going to need to do is set price equal to 0 and establish what quantity would be demanded. So we're just going to take our demand function and essentially put price equal to 0. So we're going to get 3,000 minus 15 times 0. So in other words, we end up with 3,000. Okay. So notice we can now label that up. The quantity demanded, which we're showing in the bottom right hand of our diagram, the quantity demanded when price would be 0 would be 3,000. Now, set demand equal to 0, and this will establish the maximum price. So if we set demand equal to 0 and then solve for price, so we're saying 0 equals 3,000 minus 15px. Okay, in other words, 15px equals 3,000, so 3,000 divided by 15 equals px. We get px equals 200. So this would be the price at which demand would be 0. So we've labelled that up. Notice it's on our y-axis now. So notice we can compute our consumer surplus now, because it's the area of the triangle. Half the base, well, we know the base distance is from 0 to 840, so half of 840 is 420, times the height, and the height is the difference between 200 and 144, which of course is 66. So, the area of our triangle, half base times height, we've got consumer surplus of 23,520. And of course, if it was in dollars, it would be dollars. Now let's work out the producer surplus. Now, of course, what we're going to need to establish here is the price at which supply would be equal to 0. So we're going to set QS equal to 0 and solve for PX. Now, of course, at QS equals 0, we get 0 equals minus 600 plus 10px, or if you like, 600 equals 10px. Divide both sides by 10, and of course we'll end up with 60 equals px. So, at a price of 60, the total amount supplied would be 0. So again, using our area of a triangle, half base times height, the base is between 0 and 840, so half of that is going to be 420, and the height is the difference between 144 and 60, and we get the area of our triangle, $35,280. And the total surplus, therefore, is just the two added together. So you are asked to be able to compute. We're next asked to analyse and forecast the impacts of price ceilings and price floors and taxes when they're imposed and when they're removed. So again, we've got our little diagram here where we're sitting merrily at equilibrium, okay, where supply equals demand. Now what we're going to do is look at a price ceiling. So notice there is our price ceiling that we're introducing. Now price ceilings are only going to have an effect if the price ceiling is below the equilibrium price, which clearly it is in our diagram. So it's an artificial cap that prevents price migrating to the true equilibrium level. Now you'll notice at this price ceiling, the quantity supplied, where the pink line hits our price ceiling red line, is way lower than the quantity demanded, where the demand curve, the blue line, hits our price ceiling line. So quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. Now, of course, normally prices would start to rise to the equilibrium level. But the price ceiling is a maximum price that can be charged, so that won't happen. So we'll have a permanent scenario where demand outstrips supply. There we go, demand greater than supply. Notice, therefore, that that therefore gives us the deadweight loss. Notice what you spot here, that the price is artificially low, and therefore the consumer surplus is much larger. Now I'll actually attempt to scribble in the consumer surplus area. Here it is. It's this area here. So there is your consumer surplus. Notice your producer surplus is much smaller. In aggregate, though, the two are smaller than they would be at equilibrium, giving us our deadweight loss. So in fact, consumers probably have won here, but at the cost of producers. Overall, society is worse off because there is a deadweight loss. So what do price ceilings lead to? Well, of course, we saw demand outstrip supply, and therefore you have a long waiting period to purchase. Sellers may discriminate. In other words, if there's oversupply for my courses, then I only choose blue-eyed, beautiful young ladies to attend my courses. Sounds nice. I wish that was the case. But I would start to discriminate. The seller may take bribes. In other words, consumers that want to produce the product but can't because of limited availability might offer a higher price to the seller. In other words, we start to get black markets developing. Alternatively, because the seller's price is capped, they might start to reduce the quality of the product being sold in order to try and generate greater surplus. Let's look at a price floor. Now, a price floor is only going to have an impact when it's above the equilibrium price. Price floors, classic example of this is minimum wage. So in other words, price cannot go below the floor level. So there we are at equilibrium. Let's introduce our floor price. Now notice the key is the price is above the equilibrium level. Now notice above the equilibrium level that our quantity demanded, there we go, is way lower than the quantity supplied. In other words, we have excess supply. Now, of course, normally in an efficient operating market, that will cause the price to fall to the equilibrium level. But of course, with a price floor, you cannot reduce price, so it cannot start falling. So we have excess supply. Now, of course, excess supply in the labour market is known as unemployment. So there you go, there's the quantity supplied, there's the quantity demanded, and there is our deadweight loss. Now, of course, the prices are very high here. So notice here is our consumer surplus, much smaller because they're paying a high price. And here is the producer surplus. Okay, so the producers may well like price floors. If you're a worker, you're the producer, so you will like minimum wage because that increases your surplus, but it's coming at the expense of much lower consumer surplus. Note overall it's inefficient, we can see a deadweight loss being caused. In other words, the aggregate of consumer and producer surplus is not as high as it would have been at equilibrium. So what are the impacts of a price floor? Well, we said excess supply, and if there's excess supply of the good, then essentially substitution we'll see substitution in consumption away from the price controlled good. In other words, let's imagine that we're a firm and there's minimum wage legislation and it's above our equilibrium level. Rather than demanding labour, we might become more capital intensive, more machinery intensive. So we'll substitute our consumption to a cheaper source, i.e. machinery. So yes, of course, minimum wage is a classic example. With minimum wage, we've got excess supply of labour, otherwise known as unemployment. As we just mentioned, producers therefore would go for cheaper alternatives to labour, such as capital. Okay. And of course, for workers that they do employ, because those workers are expensive to them, they'll try and reduce their costs in other ways. In other words, cutting back on non-monetary benefit, poorer working conditions, worse training, etc. The effect of taxes. Now, tax on suppliers, we're going to argue that it increases the equilibrium price and reduces the equilibrium quantity. Key point to note is taxes are going to be inefficient in as much as they are going to create deadweight losses. Now, we need to be a little bit aware about statutory incidents versus actual incidents. Statutory incidents is who physically pays the tax to the authorities. Actual incidents is who bears the cost, who is in reality being hit by the tax. Now, actual incidents, it's all about the elasticity. The more elastic demand is, the more sensitive it is to price, then it's going to be the sellers that bear the tax. If demand is inelastic, it's going to be essentially the buyers. So it's all to do with elasticity of demand, which we're going to encounter a little bit later. Actually, it's the elasticity of demand relative to the elasticity of supply that's going to affect the actual incidence. Okay, let's have a look. Here we are in our markets in equilibrium without taxes, first of all. We're going to look at the tax on producers first. We're going to introduce a tax on producers. That's going to increase the cost of producing goods, and as a result, our supply curve shifts back. Notice then we get a lower equilibrium quantity, Q tax, and we pay a higher price. And notice we've got our deadweight loss in there as well. Now, I'm not particularly interested in the tax revenue from the buyers and sellers, other than to indicate the more vertical the demand curve was, in other words, the steeper the gradient, then the less tax the buyers would pay and the more tax the sellers would pay. In other words, the more elastic demand is, the less demand that the less tax will be suffered from the buyer's point of view. So a very inelastic demand, which will be a vertical demand curve, the buyers would suffer. A very inelastic demand curve, which will be vertical, the buyers will suffer. A more elastic demand curve, so getting closer to horizontal, it's going to be the suppliers that suffer. Let's look at a tax on buyers. Now, of course, if the buyers are paying, this is going to reduce the quantity demanded at each price. So the demand curve is going to shift back. So it does. And you can see we get a lower quantity and a higher price. P tax is just the price after tax. Now again, notice we get a deadweight loss. Again, who suffers the tax depends on elasticity. The more inelastic demand is, the more the buyer will pay. The more elastic demand is, essentially, the more the supplier. So inelastic demand means the buyers suffer. Elastic demand means the sellers suffer. Now, of course, we haven't talked about the elasticity of supply. Actually, that affects it as well. Okay, inelastic supply, the suppliers would suffer. Elastic supply, the buyers would suffer. So it's all about the elasticities, all about the elasticities. So notice there's what we said earlier with an inelastic demand curve. And notice our diagram on the right-hand side is inelastic. Notice the demand curve is relatively vertical here. And notice, essentially, if it's inelastic, i.e. a vertical demand curve, notice the amount of tax burden from the buyers is that much higher. With an elastic demand curve, then the burden is going to be shifted towards the sellers. Why? Because if they try and push the burden to the buyers via higher prices, demand will fall by a greater proportion and revenues essentially will decrease. Okay, so elasticity is the key here. Yes, actual incidence depends on both the elasticity of supply and demand. Indeed it does. It's all about the elasticity. Which kind of would mean you would think we'd put elasticity before that slide, but actually elasticity is covered in a later learning outcome. Now, we've seen this already. We said overproduction leads to deadweight losses. And the reason it does is it makes supply artificially, or the cost of supply artificially low. And as a result, the supply curve will shift out because suppliers, producers, will be willing to supply more at each individual price. So with overproduction, the supply curve is going to shift out beyond the equilibrium level. Here it's because of a $30 subsidy. Okay. Now that supply curve shifts out, and you can see therefore that we end up with an increase in quantity and a dead weight loss, as mentioned before. Now that subsidy is leading to overproduction, so quotas, physical restrictions on output, must lead to underproduction. So again, we're starting off with an equilibrium quantity of 90. Let's just imagine there is a restriction on output of 60. Now that restriction on output is going to force prices up. Notice we're away from the equilibrium level, so quantity demanded is going to be greater than quantity supplied. And as a result, we get, come on, there we go, a dead weight loss. Now our last real LOS here is to calculate and interpret elasticities. And our first one is price elasticity of demand, PD. Notice it's the percentage change in quantity over the percentage change in price. In other words, we're looking at how sensitive quantity demanded is to changes in price. We're going to talk about elastic demand. If the percentage change in quantity is greater than percentage change in price, then we're elastic. A small change in price will lead to a bigger change in quantity. Now, so for example, remember there's an inverse relationship between price and demand. So we typically expect price elasticity to be negative. So for example, if when prices fell by 10%, quantity demanded rose by more than 10%, we're talking about elastic demand. Now, if demand is relatively insensitive to prices, i.e. the percentage change in quantity is lower than the percentage change in price, we are talking about inelastic demand. Okay, so notice in our diagrams, and we kind of talked about this with tax before, elastic gives you a relatively horizontal demand curve because small changes in price lead to large changes in quantity. Inelastic gives you a virtually vertical or more vertical demand curve because essentially large changes in price only have a small impact on quantity. Remember, quantity demanded changes by less as a percentage than price. Now notice perfectly inelastic, the perfectly inelastic demand there is totally horizontal. And we're then saying demand is completely insensitive to price. Price has no effect on demand. Whereas perfectly elastic, we have horizontal. Any change in price leads to demand dropping to zero. We'll come back to perfectly elastic demand when we talk about perfect competition later. What affects demand elasticity? Well, there are a number of things, but actually only three things that we need to be aware of in the exam. The first one is going to be the closeness of substitute products. Now, the increased number of substitutes available, the increase in elasticity. Because essentially, if you increase your prices, consumers will switch to the substitute products with a lower price. So more substitutes, more elasticity. Proportion of income spent on each item. Argument here, the greater the proportion, the greater the elasticity. So for example, let's say each Friday night I go out after class and buy myself some sweets in a sweet shop. It's probably more likely to be beers, but we'll talk about those issues maybe some other time. Okay, so we're going to go out and buy some sweets. And they only cost me, let's say, 10 cents, about 5 pence in the UK. One day I go to the shop and they've doubled the price to 20 cents or 10p. Do I care? No, because it's such a small proportion of my income, I don't really care about it. I'll probably still pay it. And as a result, because it's a small proportion of my income, I'm relatively price inelastic. Now, if we're talking about luxury goods, of course, which are much more expensive and consume a bigger proportion of my income, I'm going to be far more elastic because changes in price here are going to affect my wealth, my overall wealth. Then the final one is time elapsed since price change. The basic idea is the greater the time, the greater the elasticity. The idea is initially when prices change, consumers are unaware of alternatives. So they'll continue to consume your good even though you've put prices up. So demand is relatively inelastic in the short run. However, with time to research alternatives, then we'll find what other substitutes are available and maybe switch to these substitutes. So with a longer time frame, our demand becomes elastic. Okay, so we're looking at elasticity on a straight-lined demand curve. Now, what we're saying is elasticity changes along the demand curve. That should give you a heads up that elasticity is not the same as the gradient of the demand curve. Okay, it isn't the same as the gradient. Can't be, otherwise elasticity would have to be the same on a straight line. Now, let's talk about point A. We're on a highly elastic part of the demand curve. Now, if you're highly elastic, if you change price, quantity demanded will increase or change by a bigger proportion. Now, it therefore makes sense that if you're in the elastic part of the demand curve, that you cut your prices. Because if you cut your prices, quantity demanded will increase by a larger proportion, thus maximizing your revenue. So the logic is cut prices if you're on an elastic part of the demand curve. And as we cut our prices, we move closer and closer to unitary elasticity. Now, unitary elasticity is the point where the percentage change in price is equal to the percentage change in quantity. In other words, total revenue is unaffected. Now, below unitary elasticity, we get our inelastic part of the demand curve. Now, if you find you're on an inelastic part of the demand curve, it makes sense for you to increase prices. Now, remember, with inelasticity, we're saying the quantity demanded is insensitive to price. So as you increase your price, quantity demanded falls by a smaller proportion, helping maximize your revenues. So in other words, if you want to maximize your revenue, you should operate on the part of the demand curve where your elasticity is -1, unitary elasticity. If you're above it, you should cut your prices to maximize revenue. And if you're below it, you should increase your prices to maximize revenue. Yes, so greatest total revenue, price times quantity, is at the unitary elasticity part. In the inelastic range, it makes sense to increase price because that will increase revenue. Remember, quantity demanded falls by a smaller proportion than change in price. If you're on the elastic part, cut your prices because remember, quantity demanded will change by a bigger proportion than price. So here is our classic elasticity of demand calculation, where they say, okay, percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in income. And we talk about normal goods and inferior goods. With a normal good, we're talking about income elasticity. I was very sorry, let's start that again. Income elasticity of demand. So we're looking at the sensitivity of demand to changes in your income. So percentage change in quantity demanded over your percentage change in income. Normal goods, as your income increases, you demand more and more of them. In other words, they have an elasticity that is greater, an income elasticity that is greater than 0. Inferior goods, as your income goes up, the quantity demanded starts to drop. In other words, you get a negative elasticity for inferior goods. Cross-price elasticity of demand looks at the elasticity of demand of maybe substitute products or complementary products. Now let's start off with substitute products. We've got price of coffee and price of tea. Now you would expect if the price of coffee increases, the demand for tea will increase as people switch out of coffee into tea. So we would expect, therefore, let's have a little look at this. Our change in price of coffee is 16.65%, and that leads to a change in demand for tea of 11.1%. So we get an elasticity of 0.6. Notice you get essentially a positive elasticity. Now, of course, if you're looking at complementary products, you'd expect your elasticity to be negative for cross-price elasticity. Now, I always use the example of gin and tonic, as we mentioned earlier. If the price of gin goes up, people will demand less tonic. So on the bottom, you have the price of your complementary product, and on the top, you have the change in demand. We would, as we said, expect the demand here to be negative if prices are rising. So expect cross-price elasticity of demand for complementary products to be negative. Now, our next LOS is a little bit surreal, I think. It's calculating elasticities, but we're calculating them from regression equations, which just seems very odd, but, you know, theoretically it's sound. I just don't think anyone would ever do this in the real world. Having said that, we need to do it for our exam. So let's have a little look at the formula that we've got. The quantity demanded is equal to 4,000, our intercept term, minus the first slope coefficient of minus 140 times price, plus the second coefficient of 0.75 times income, and minus the third coefficient, minus 300, times PY, PY being the price of complementary products. So in other words, we're saying quantity demanded is a function of price, income, and price of complements. Now we're going to assume that we know income levels, so our income level is 40,000 euros, and the price of complementary products, remember, negative cross-price elasticity, is 15. Now, if we know that, we can plug those numbers in. So we're going to say quantity demanded equals 4,000 minus 140 px. We can then do income times 0.75 times 40,000 to get 30,000, and minus 300 times 15 to get minus 4,500. So let's just rearrange our equation a little bit. So summarizing that down, we're saying quantity demanded is 29,500 minus 140 px. Okay. Right, okay, let's take this information and talk about how we can use it to compute the elasticity of demand. So remember, price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity over the percentage change in price. Notice percentage change in quantity is the change in quantity divided by original quantity, and the percentage change in price is the change in price over original price. That can be written as original price divided by original quantity times the change in quantity over the change in price. Now, change in quantity over change in price, of course, is the slope coefficient. It is the gradient of our demand curve. So actually what we're saying is the slope coefficient minus 140 is the gradient of our curve here. But notice, therefore, the slope coefficient is not the same as elasticity. In order to get elasticity, we need to take that slope coefficient and multiply it by the original price over the original quantity. So let's calculate our price elasticity demand at a price level of 150 euros. So there's our formula. Quantity demanded equals 9,500 minus 140 px. Let's plug in 150 euros for px, and we get 29,000 minus 140 times 150. Multiply that out, and you get 8,500. Now that we've got that 8,500, that gives us quantity demanded, and we've also got price 150. In other words, we've now got P0 and Q0, and we can multiply that by our slope coefficient, which is minus 140, to get elasticity. So our elasticity of demand is P0 over Q0, so 150 over 8,500, times the slope coefficient of minus 140. We've got a negative price elasticity of demand of 2.47. Negative? Surprising? No, of course, quantity and prices move inversely. An elasticity of 2.47. So we're saying if price changes, quantity demanded changes by a much bigger proportion, So what part of the demand curve are we on? Well, the answer is the elastic part of the demand curve. A result of less than 1 or less than negative 1 would be inelastic. Let's have a look at income elasticity of demand. Again, in order to calculate income elasticity of demand, we're going to assume that we know the price of the good and the price of the complement, and solve initially, therefore, for I. So, plugging those numbers in and solving for an income of 40,000, there we go, there's our demand function first of all. So 4,000, we've then got 140 times 150, so minus 21,000, plus 0.75 times your income, minus 300 times 15, minus 4,500. So let's calculate income elasticity at an income of 40,000. Yeah, sorry, summarizing that down gives you that, far enough. Okay, so what we're saying is minus 21,500 plus 0.75 times your income is the quantity demanded. Now, at an income level of 40,000, 0.75 times 40,000 gives us 30,000. So we're saying the quantity demanded is minus 21,500 plus 30,000, which of course gives us 8,500. Now we can calculate our income elasticity of demand. Because when we look at our formula, notice the income elasticity of demand is I naught, so the original income over the original quantity. So 40,000 over 8,500 times the slope coefficient. And the slope coefficient of the income independent variable was 0.75. So we get an income elasticity of 3.53. So essentially, we're looking at a normal good. And in fact, it's probably actually a luxury good, because not only is it positive, but it's greater than 1. Cross-price elasticity. So we've got our, what was it originally? It was a complementary product, hence it had a negative coefficient. So notice here, percentage change in quantity over percentage change in price of the complement. And notice that distills down into original price over original quantity times the change in quantity times the change in price of the, divided by the change in price of the complement. Now again, change in quantity over change in PY, that is the slope coefficient, and we've got that minus 300. So if we know the price of our product, X, and the income level, 40,000, first of all, let's expand out our equation. So we get 4,000 minus 150 times minus 140 minus 21,000. The income level, 40,000 times 0.75, 30,000. So 4,000 minus 21,000 plus 30,000 minus 300 PY. Let's summarize that down, and we're going to get 13,000 minus 300 PY. Okay, now, if we assume that the price of the complement is 15 euros, let's calculate our price elasticity, our cross-price elasticity of demand. So what we're going to need to do is insert 15 euros for PY, so we end up with 13,000 minus 4,500, which boils down to 8,500. So PY over Q0 is going to be 15 divided by 8,500. We then need to multiply by the change in quantity over the change in the complement's price. And of course, change in Q over change in PY is just the slope coefficient of minus 300. So we can compute cross-price elasticity but as 15 divided by 8,500 times minus 300 to get minus 0.53. Now, of course, what that is saying is as the price of the complement goes up, the quantity demanded of our product is going to drop, but by a smaller proportion. Notice because it's less than 1, 0.53. Okay, and that is the end of this reading.